Rabbi Layla is joining us, as I said, for the next few months. But many of you know Rabbi Layla from teaching in our community before. Layla and Frana, her wife, were members of the synagogue for a very long time. Have now moved to Frederick, Maryland. So it's a little bit too long a commute. But I wholeheartedly welcome you to be our teacher, to be my teacher for the next few months. And I welcome you to teach our class today on Parsha Yitro.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. I look forward to it. We always start with bracha for Torah study, so I invite you to join me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav u'manu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so we are starting with Parashat Yitro, and Yitro is a very important person in this story. He has quite an influence on Moshe, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at the relationship, and we're going to look at that influence. And Audrey, could you put up the screen share? And we're going to start out by reading the beginning of the Parsha, chapter 18 of Sefer Shmot of Exodus, starting with verse 1. Can you move it up just a tad? That's good. Okay, can someone please read chapter 18, verses 1 through 12?
Exodus 18:17. Moses' father-in-law brings Moses' wife Zipporah and Moses' 2 sons to reunite with Moses after a long time away from him. During the
Gertie, if you could read from the text itself, 18 verses 1 through 12, starting out with Jethro, priest of Midian.
I don't see that.
It's not in the handout. It's just in the text. If you have the Tanakh or the Chumash.
I don't have it in front of me, so maybe somebody else should read.
Someone who has the text in front of you do have that.
I can read that.
I have it.
Oh, okay. Shlomo, go ahead.
I'm not reading from the Plout, however, but I'll read what I have.
I'm reading. I have the JPS Tanakh, but whatever one you have.
Okay. Now Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her away, and her 2 sons, of whom the name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. And the name of the other was Eliezer, for the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife unto Moses into the wilderness where he was encamped at the mount of God. And he said unto Moses, I, thy father-in-law Jethro, am coming unto thee, and thy wife and her 2 sons with her. And Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. And they asked each other of their welfare, and they came into the tent. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done unto Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the travail that had come upon them by the way, and how the Lord delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced for all the goodness which the Lord had done to Israel, in that he had delivered them out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro blessed be the Lord. And Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord, who hath delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who hath delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, yea, for that they dealt proudly against them. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God And Aaron came, and all the elders of Israel, to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God.
Okay, great. Thank you, Shlomo. So what we have here is the first example of an interfaith relationship and a relationship between a Midianite priest who expresses what we call monolatry, a belief in the superior power of one God over many other gods. He still believes in many other gods, but he believes that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, the God of Israel, is the most powerful of all the gods. He offers a burnt offering, and he says, "Blessed is this God." Notice also that Moshe is not terribly connected to his family, to Zipporah and to Gershom and to Eliezer. When they come, he immediately goes into the tent with Jethro, but he doesn't emote very much with his own family. Moshe has been separated from his wife and children. They have been sojourning with Jethro, and indeed, the two sons, the names of the two sons, indicate that he's a Gershom, and God is Eliezer's help, not his own father. Moshe is an absentee father. And it seems that Yitro has more of a relationship with these boys, with these sons, than Moshe himself has. This is the sad situation of children of many public figures, and just wanted to point that out, that Moshe doesn't have much of a relationship with his own children. So let's move on a little bit into more of the relationship between Yitro and Moshe. Let's read verses 13 through 27.
May I do it?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
13 through 27.
Yes.
Next. Okay, and I'm using this.
Okay, great.
Next day, Moses sat as magistrate among the people, while the people stood about Moses from morning until evening. But when Moses' father-in-law saw how much he had to do for the people, he said, "What is this thing that you are doing to the people? Why do you act alone, while all the people stand about you from morning until evening?" Moses replied to his father-in-law, "It is because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, it comes before me, and I decide between one person and another, and I make known the laws and teachings of God." But Moses' father-in-law said to him, "The thing you are doing is not right. You will surely wear yourself out, and these people as well. For the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. Now listen to me. I will give you counsel, and God be with you. You represent the people before God. You bring the disputes before God, and enjoin upon them the laws and the teachings, and make known to them the way they are to go and the practices they are to follow. You shall also seek out from among all the people capable men who fear God, trustworthy men who spurn ill-gotten gain. Set these over them as chiefs of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens, and let them judge the people at all times. Have them bring every major dispute to you, but let them decide every minor dispute themselves. Make it easier for yourself by letting them share the burden with you. If you do this, and God so commands you, you will be able to bear up, and all these people too will go home unwearied." Moses heeded his father-in-law and did just as he had said. Moses chose capable men out of all Israel, and appointed them heads over the people, chiefs of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens, and they judged the people at all times. The difficult matters they would bring to Moses, and all the minor matters they would decide themselves. Then Moses bade his father farewell, and he went his way to his own land.
So what we have here is the beginning of a prototype of a judicial system. It's the first judicial system that Israel is going to have. One of the things you will notice in the entire Exodus story is the establishment of the rudimentary systems of a people. When I teach my classes in Aleph, I teach that the maturation of the people comes not only theologically, which it does. The people are not monotheists as they start out, but it comes slowly but surely during the entire wilderness wandering. Also, the rudimentary mechanisms of what a people is going to be begin to happen during this wanderings in the desert, and this is the first of them. Moses is, as you see here in the handout, is a profoundly overworked man. He doesn't know how to delegate. He doesn't know how to delegate, and Yitro is the first one amongst the people around him who says, you can't do this. It will exhaust you, but furthermore, it will be unhealthy for the people. You will leave them as powerless. Remember what he says here. He says, it is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. You represent the people. And then he goes on to give him a formula as to how to do this. Find capable men and let them take on the minor courts, as it were. And the big cases, you are the Supreme Court. But the smaller cases, let them adjudicate and let them bring the big cases to you. Can someone please read on the handout here, starting with the paragraph that says, to adapt Juliet Shore's phrase?
This is Nancy, and I'd be happy to read it.
Sure, thank you, Nancy.
To adapt Juliet Shore's phrase from the title of her cautionary work, The Overworked American, The Unexpected Decline of Leisure, let me suggest that Moses is the quintessential overworked Israelite. Just having led his people across the Red Sea, Moses continues to lead the people unilaterally, consulting no one, depleting his own energies and sapping his people's energy as they must wait for hours from morning to evening for an individual audience with their leader. Our Torah portion offers a negative leadership model here. Moses' claim to sole authority may be viewed as the height of chutzpah, as an expression of a prophet's lack of confidence that anyone other than he himself is capable of responsibly executing the task of judging the people. Indeed, several ancient rabbis addressed the issue of Moses' ego, pointing to his foolishness in assuming he alone must carry the entire burden of the Israelite people on his shoulders. The ancient sages concluded that Moses' assumption of sole control is a dangerous manifestation of hubris, an arrogance that might ultimately lead to Moses' own collapse, and perhaps even to the collapse of the whole people who are overly dependent on him and thereby disempowered by him.
Go on, please.
Okay. Jethro's advice to his son-in-law is instructive. You shall provide out of all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating unjust gain, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands and rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s and rulers of 10s, and let them judge the people at all seasons. So it shall be easier for you, and they shall bear the burden with you.
Okay, can someone else read starting at on the next page, please, Audrey?
I can do that.
Okay.
What can we learn from Jethro's advice? Perhaps one important set of messages in this text is that, first, no one need work so hard as to exhaust oneself completely. Second, every person, even Moses, needs assistance and support. Third, there is never only one person able to do any job. Fourth, there is wisdom in consulting with others and sharing leadership. And fifth, sharing leadership empowers others in one's community and strengthens the community as a whole. Later Torah narrative seems to advocate a far less unilateral form of leadership for the Israelites. After Moses' death, his name recedes from our people's story. Joshua leads the people with the tribal elders, help and ladder. Many judges rise to lead the people. Even the anointing of Israel's first king, Saul, is presented in biblical tradition as a less than desirable form of governance. In later Jewish history, decisions, customs, and practices evolved through the conversations of many rabbis and communal leaders. And in our rabbinic literature, the Talmud, for example, all opinions, even minority ones, were recorded and deemed worthy of respectful consideration. For us Jews, in our often all too divided world community, we might discern an even wider significance in the text. This Torah teaching may offer us a valuable communal message that just as Moses could not carry the burden of guiding the Israelites people alone, so there is no sector of the Jewish world that can afford to isolate itself from the other sectors. Perhaps the text teaches that we need each other, that as a people, we benefit most when we are able to hear and listen to many voices, when we allow ourselves to engage in respectful dialogue with one another, and consider a spectrum of different approaches to community, to faith, to Israel, to Judaism. Perhaps the text teaches that we are strengthened by our diversity, and that in our shared responsibility for the good health of Judaism, we find we find our true strength. If there is hope for the Jewish unity, it will come as a unity in diversity, a unity that acknowledges and affirms many leaders, many teachers, prophets, and judges. If there is hope for us as Jews, it will come when a group of Jews is so arrogant as to believe that they alone can or should carry the decision-making power or the burden of responsibility for the whole Jewish people. If there is a hope for Jewish strength and unity, it will come when each Jew can say, as our ancient sages said about themselves, with all their disagreements, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim. These opinions, ideas, and thoughts, and these different opinions, ideas, and thoughts are all expressions of our living God.
I think all of this came from Yitro's admonition to Moshe. And so the multiplicity of ideas and thoughts and voices that came with the establishment of the judges in the wilderness really came from Yitro and was a corrective to what might have been Moshe's unilateral leadership of the people, which would have been very, very bad for the people. It's not coincidental that that Moshe's name doesn't appear after his death. It's not coincidental that a new leadership arises and many, many new names come into the picture of leadership. So before we go on to the next part, which in some ways supports this idea, let's open this up for a few minutes of reflection from all of you. What do you think of this interpretation of the text, and what are your thoughts about Yitro, the relationship between Yitro and Moshe? If we can take down the screen share for a moment so we can see the entire body here. And if, yes, Steve.
Okay, so I wasn't the first hand up, but I will speak first. I guess I just was reacting to some of the commentary there that it seemed like
You just went muted, Steve.
it seems like it was a condemnation of Moses' ego, etc. Whereas another perspective could be that that Moses just felt, given his direct communication from God, that he had an obligation to try to do all this, and it wasn't until Yitro's more sober advice that he was able to step back and gain the support of these other just judges, so to speak, or just voices throughout the community to help do the job. So, it seemed like it was a quote, somewhat of a soft attack on Moses for having done all this on his own, or trying to do it all on his own. And perhaps that's a little bit harsh. That was my only reaction.
Okay. Other thoughts?
Hi, it's Miriam.
Mhm.
I kind of feel there are double messages here. I mean, we've made a lot of this episode with Yitro. But first of all, Moses has not yet been at Sinai. And he's supposedly teaching God's message. He says he's judging by God's law, which of course hasn't gotten yet. And the other point is, he has exclusive access on Sinai, which ever after becomes his total monopoly. Everything else, the rabbis have to say, well, everybody else was hearing something too at Sinai. But in fact, according to the story, Moses has exclusive access to God, and what he says is what is God's word, and that's that. And that authoritarian tradition hasn't exactly been missing from our history. I just thought you might want to comment on that.
Well, I'm not sure I want to comment on it. I think you're right to a certain extent that Moses' authoritarian position has been celebrated by the rabbis, but there are many others who also don't celebrate it, and they say that not only was it too much of a burden on him, but that it diminished the possibilities that Moses was simply a man, and that he had his ma'alot, he had his great attributes, and he also had many weaknesses. They point to his anger problem, for example, and that perhaps had he not been as burdened as he was, even with the judges, that we might have had different outcomes. But other than that, I'm not going to comment more on it. Ralph, I see Ralph, and I see.
Yeah, I want to build on that a little bit more, because although the Exodus coming out of Egypt, coming to Sinai, is such a seminal part, such a beginning, is such an important part of our whole story. If we take this literally, they're coming out of Egypt from they've been very deprived. They've been isolated from each other, and so it's a real mixed bag. It's a real ragtag group of people without much of a tradition. And all of a sudden, Moses has to impose the whole tradition, a whole backstory on them. And so I'm trying to understand what this must be like. He's making judgments, and they didn't really have tradition then, because they'd all been slaves. And so he has a tremendous burden of kind of establishing even a sense of having a centralized order. So that, I wonder if you have any comment about that.
Right. Well, I think that, the question is, how did he know what the established order was going to be? He was being given a message by God, but we're not sure that he had the whole truth before him anyway, even though he was being brought later, soon, very soon, to Sinai to be given the Torah. But even he didn't necessarily understand it all. There are many, many commentaries about his ability to understand what he was being given. And beware of interpretation through one individual of a whole sacred tradition. I would leave it with that. Philip.
Just a couple of points. One is, I wonder why Moshe didn't figure it out himself. He was a pretty smart guy. He had become very articulate, certainly during the last of the plagues and so forth, and he clearly was doing a reasonable job of leadership. On the other hand, it kind of reminds me of when I was a young manager. Nobody ever told me about delegation. I had to, figure it out myself and through, management classes and so forth. So, maybe in this case, Yitro is the equivalent of Wharton for Moses.
Say that again, the equivalent
So I
of?
say maybe he's the equivalent of Wharton Business School for Moses.
Could be, could be. Okay, let's move on. Let's go to the other pivotal part of Parashat Yitro. I'm sorry, Shlomo, I didn't see you, so go right ahead, and then we'll move on.
I was before Shlomo.
Yeah, I think Bob Barkin and Michael Ackerman had their hands up before me.
I'm sorry. Where's Bob?
Just a short comment. I don't find it surprising that Moses didn't trust his elders. Back when he was going to Pharaoh, God said, take your elders, you and Aaron, and take your elders and confront Pharaoh. And all of a sudden the elders disappeared. And it was just Moses and Aaron. And so, there's something to be said that, yes, he needs to delegate, but he also needs people to delegate. And I think there's something to be said that maybe Moses had to build trust among the people that he needed in his subordinates.
Good point. Good point. And Michael, and then Shlomo, and then we'll move on.
Well, I'm not so sure that that Moses didn't think that he could do it, because after all, look at all the miraculous things that Moses was doing through the strength of God. So why couldn't he judge everybody? Why couldn't he do Superman things? And the other thing, reacting on another set, I believe that this is one of those parts of Torah that is not time sensitive, that this is in here for some reason, and it has nothing to do, because they got 7 weeks, if we go by the time clock, from Egypt to Sinai. And they already wasted some time crossing the sea and whatever that. How's the man going to put this all together? And how's he working so hard? He's got 5 weeks to do this, and he's moving the people right along and so on. This is something that perhaps is beyond Sinai, which is why he knew what the law was. And it was stuck in here. And the big question is, why? Why was it put here when it's impossible for it to happen on a time sequence?
That's an interesting point. Does anyone have Richard Friedman's the source the Torah with sources revealed handy? I don't want to take the time. Can you look up Exodus 18 1 through 12? Exodus.
It's all It all looks like E.
E.
The whole darn thing.
Uh-huh. Which means that it's a little later.
Yeah.
So Michael, you might have a point. You might definitely have a point there. Okay, Shlomo, and then we're going to go on to our next point.
Yeah, the English translation that we've read makes it seem like it's a wonderful relationship between Moshe and Yitro. But I want to point out that the Hebrew in 1827 is Vayishalach Moshe et Chotno. He didn't kind of escort him out. He sent him back to Moshe sent. The word Yishalach is the same word that Moshe uses when he wants Pharaoh to send the people out. Shlach et Ami. So I find it interesting that the translators may have wanted to present, I find this a pretty strong word. Vayishalach Moshe et Chotno, vayelech lo el arzo. Moses sent his father-in-law, and his father-in-law went to his own land.
Uh-huh.
So it suggests.
It may not have been as rosy as it looks.
Right.
Possible. Okay, let's look at the next part. If you could put back the thing. Let's read together chapter 19, 16, 20 first. Who would like to read that?
I'll read it.
Okay.
19, 16,
Verses 16 on the third day.
Okay. On the third day, as morning dawned, there was thunder and lightning, and a dense cloud upon the mountain, and a very loud blast of the horn. And all the people who were in the camp trembled. Moses led the people out of the camp toward God, and they took their places at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, for the Eternal had come down upon it in fire. The smoke rose like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled violently. The blare of the horn grew louder and louder. As Moses spoke, God answered him in thunder. The Eternal came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, and the Eternal One called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up.
Okay. Very interesting that we look at the Hebrew here, because in the beginning where it says, on the third day as morning dawned, there was thunder and lightning. Thunder here in Hebrew is kolot, which is plural, voices. There were voices and lightning. Note that when Yud He Vav He speaks to the people, God speaks in thunder, in kolot, in voices, plural. But then just a little bit later, it says, the blare of the horn grew louder and louder, the shofar grew louder and louder. As Moses spoke, God answered him bekol, in a voice. It's singular. So we have to ask, why does God speak in many voices to the people at the foot of the mountain? And then God speaks to Moshe in one voice. What kind of voices are these? One Hasidic answer, Menachem Mendel of Rimano, for example, imagines the scene quite differently by reflecting on the sound of the Hebrew letter Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The first word that God speaks here, Anochi. Aleph is a silent letter, so perhaps the Israelites heard only the first letter of the first word, and all the rest was understood. But we want to ask the question, why were there kolot? Why were there many voices of God? And then Moshe hears only one voice. So what are we hearing here? And let's take down the screen share, and let's see about if anyone has any ideas. Myrna, were you raising your hand? Yes, go ahead.
Well, we know that they were a multitude. They were not one type, they were not one ethnic group, presumably. So God then might have spoken. The image I have is if they were a multitude of people, of peoples, then God spoke to each group of people in a way that they understood. While when God spoke to Moshe, he was speaking to only one person and therefore could speak in one voice.
Good, good. Okay, Luther?
Well, each individual human being is an image of God. But because we're individual human beings, the voice of God must be a different voice for each one of us.
Right, right. So what's happening here is a individual message, an individual word, a davar that is coming to each individual person standing at Sinai. Marcia or Kevin, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, this is continuing the same thought that each Jew hears the Torah and interprets it the way they feel they understand it, and hopefully together it all works as a community. Last week we talked, for example, about the tefillin, and this also ties back to the previous comment that there are 4 boxes in the shell rosh, in the head one, and there's 1 box in the arm. That Jews may have different opinions on things, different interpretations, but they need to act as a unified community, Kol Yisrael Chayalim Zeh Lazeh.
Right,
So,
right.
I'm going to add a remark. I happen to be studying this year a little bit of the Sifat Emet, and his comment is that each individual at that moment experienced their own inner divinity and gifts. So I think Luther was right on.
Right. I think that what we have here is we have a profound statement of Shivim Panim La Torah, 70 faces to the Torah, not 70, but an infinity of faces to the Torah, and that each individual as Tselem Elohim receives it very differently. And that's why we can't say that there is just one Torah. We can't say that there's just one interpretation, but there are as many interpretations as there are human beings to hear and learn and study Torah. And that brings us to the whole question of choice. What do we choose as we study and learn Torah? What does it teach us about choice? What does it teach us about what we choose to absorb and integrate into ourselves about Torah? Shlomo?
I think that God himself alludes to everything that we've just said, particularly what Luther said and what Marcia just backed up, when he identifies himself at the burning bush as Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh. I will be whatever I will be, depending on whose ears my words are falling on. So I think there's an allusion, a suggestion to what we're talking about here already at Mount Sinai.
Absolutely.
I mean, at the burning bush.
Absolutely. And this is from that Parsha, which isn't this one, but I love it so much I want to share it with you. There's an amazing midrash about the burning bush, that when God says to Moshe, take the take your sandals off and take your na'alaim off. There are a couple of amazing midrashim about that the word na'alaim has the same cognate root as man'ul, as locks, Locks. So it's taking the locks off your body, meaning take the habits, take off your habits, so that you can absorb what I, the ever-evolving God, I, the ever-moving, dynamic, fluid God, will tell to you. So it's very interesting, that interpretation in terms of this revelation. Each person takes the ever-evolving, the Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh God, and accepts that message, that revelation into themselves. But knowing that they have to do it not in a rigid way in the locks of their hearts and souls, but in a ever-evolving way themselves, knowing that at one point in their lives and their spirits, they will hear it one way, and at another moment they will hear it differently. Similarly, Moshe himself has to take the message of God, the one voice, and not rigidify it into only one message. He has to take it in differently at different times, so he himself is not locked into his own habits. David. And then I see Marcia have raised her hand again. So David and then Marcia.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's a beautiful interpretation, but just to be honest with ourselves, it's sort of contrary to the pshat, to the simple, straightforward meaning, which is people did whatever they wanted up to now, and now they're getting a set of laws to be together as a community. So it's not each individual, it's actually engraved on a stone tablet. I mean, it's the same, the process we've got from Yitro, which is that there's an appeals process, and ultimately there's a Supreme Court, which is God. Moses takes it to God, and there's an answer that comes down. And similarly here, I think the multiplicity of voices, again, in a way, I wish the Torah really said it, and it's a great interpretation, but I think it's hard to get an interpretation that is so departs, I think, pretty dramatically from the straight meaning of the text. But maybe that's what we need to do. I don't know.
Well, my view of it is that it doesn't dramatically depart, because even in following the covenantal law, there's a great deal of interpretation as to how one does that. Nothing is entirely pshat in the law. That's why we have Mishnah and Talmud. If it were so straightforward, we would have one interpretation and that would be it. But the interpretation of what it says in that law is there are myriad interpretations, and that's why we have choice, and that's why the rabbis go where they do in their argumentation about it. So it's not quite so straightforward as one would think. Marcia?
I was going to say, I think what touches me and surprises me is that, Moses is willing to listen to Yitro. And with all this talk about each one of us hearing God's voice, there's a certain amount of hubris in this. And here is Moshe going, stretching himself to listen to Yitro, the other. And I think you can look at the letters Yud Taf Resh and Yitro's name, and sometimes it's translated as the rest. So I just added that as a little
That's
interpretation.
lovely. That's lovely. Yitro represents the rest of the story. The rest of the story.
Rest of the story, or in my mind, the other.
The other. Very good. Very good. Very good. So, what else do you see in this? In this parsha is also the Ten Commandments. Do you see anything in the Ten Commandments that, excuse me, that is, I'm thinking about David's comment, and I'm thinking, is it straightforward, or are they themselves not so straightforward? What does it mean to say you shall not steal? The rabbis go to town with that, because what is theft? There are whole tractates about that. What constitutes theft? What constitutes ownership? What constitutes stealing something? So remember that the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, are really only an abstract of 613 mitzvot. They are tiny little précis of what the full halacha is. So how do we relate to this? And what do we do with these 10 commandments as they are put here? David?
Just to clarify, I certainly didn't mean that there's only one possible way to interpret any of this stuff. That's obviously not right. And of course, interpretations clarify and change over time. I think the part that I was sort of taking issue with is the idea that it's an individual process, that each of us hears God in a different voice, that each of us interprets or applies all of these principles in a way that makes the most sense or is most meaningful to ourselves. So it's not the idea that there's only one way to understand it. It's the idea that each individual picks their own way. Because I think a lot that may be true in a lot of aspects, but in general, what we're learning is a way to conduct ourselves, to act as a community. And inherently, it doesn't work if we each interpret something like "thou shalt not steal." What does it mean? Whatever it means, it's the same rule for everybody. It's not, well, I think stealing is this, but you think stealing is that.
Right. No, I wasn't implying that you were doing that. I didn't see that at all. What I saw, when I say that each individual interprets Torah in their own way, what I am saying is that it's all within a context of a covenant that needs to be taken into consideration, and the covenant includes that system, and it's an ethical, moral system, although we might argue about some of its ethics and morals for our own time, but that it is within that system, so that it isn't so individualistic that one can simply say, well, I see it this way and I go my own way. It has to be within a communal, covenantal system, and cannot be discarded from that. But there is a certain amount of choice within the context of what each person perceives and what each person sees. Steve, I see you.
Yes, so, a couple phrases come to mind that are very contemporary for all of us, and that, so I feel it's sort of this wrestling between absolutism versus relativism, and the idea of, alternative facts that is in our consciousness, and also even from a different decade, what the meaning of is. You can go to either extreme and say it's only this way or the highway, or you could say there's nothing that's absolute, it's all relative. And so there is that obvious tension that we all wrestle with.
Right. Marcia?
No, this time it's Kevin.
Kevin.
That's okay. We're ambidextrous. What, to me, steal is different from the other negative commandments. When you murder somebody, it's quite clear what's happened. When you're telling a lie in court, it's perjury. When you're when you have adultery, I won't go into how explicit that is an actual act. Coveting is something you do personally, but it doesn't impact on the other person. To me, stealing has two connotations. The first is that you may actually be taking something away from somebody, the way we think of robbing it. So you may be taking some money, you may be taking a spiritual object that means a lot to them. But it also can be taking away the opportunity for them to do something. So stealing is not always materialistic. It may be putting a stumbling block in front of a person so they're forced to fall. It's more than just a single act of taking something away, unless you put the something as opportunity to do something else.
Absolutely. There is a concept in halakha called gnevat da'at, the stealing of the mind. That, for example, one may, let's take a contemporary example. You're buying a car, and you have represented the car as being in perfect condition, when it's actually had 3 accidents and there are flaws in the car. But you don't tell the potential customer about that. And the customer buys the car, and then the car breaks down. What you have done is you have stolen the person's knowledge, and that is equally a form of theft according to halakha. So it's much more subtle than just stealing an item, and it can have catastrophic consequences. It can you steal someone's knowledge of something, not even a car, that could be catastrophic. If the person has an accident because of the flaw in the car and gets gravely hurt or something like that. But it's a very, very subtle, theft is a very subtle thing. And that's why we have to look at these, and we have to say, I can't go only by the Decalogue. I have to go back and I have to investigate what the halakha says in much, much more detail. And that's why it's so important that we have the Mishnah and we have the Talmud and we have the argumentation about each one of these commandments, so that we can nuance them and we can find out what's really, really going on in a much deeper level. So that's why when people say, well, there are the 10 commandments, and that's we've got them. We have to be very, very careful with them, and be very, very, and know that all they are abbreviations for much, much more complex arguments. Shlomo?
I again want to commend the redactors of Torah. And I believe that the ambiguities that we're focusing on, and sometimes the two different stories of the same events, are purposefully written that way, because what the redactors wanted was for us 2,600 years later to be doing exactly what we're doing.
Exactly.
which is to be saying, what does this mean? Oh, let's hear from this guy. Let's hear from that person. So they wanted us to be talking about what this all means and giving us opportunity to understand the different possible meanings at the different times that we're having our discussion. So I just, again, I mean, the redactors of Torah were just incredible writers, and I think it's really their goal to have us doing what we're doing.
Right, right. Okay, any other thoughts before we, it's hard to, there are two screens and I want to make sure
Well,
that
it's much like the multiple voices we were talking about before.
right, that's exactly what we're doing. That's exactly what we're doing. I'm looking at the two screens. It's hard for me to see everybody. So it's interesting to me that Moshe goes up the mountain with the one voice, and he's not, he tells the people not to gaze upon God. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh says to Moshe, go down, warn the people not to break through to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh to gaze, lest many of them perish. The priests also who come near to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh must stay pure, lest Adonai break out against them. But Moshe said to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, the people cannot come up to Har Sinai, for you warned us, saying, set bounds upon the mountain and sanctify it. So Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh said to him, go down and come back together with Aharon, but not the priests, or the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them. And Moses went down to the people and spoke to them. And there he gives them the 10 Commandments. And then all the people witnessed again the thunder, which is voices. Again, it's in the plural. It's emphasizing the plural. I'm looking on the chat. Wrestling with God, predicate theology, perhaps we wrestle with godliness. I'm not sure I understand all these quotes. Marsha and Kevin, you say Rashi writes that Moshe sent Jethro back to his people now that Jethro knew God. That's in response to Shlomo's comment about sending Jethro back.
Yep.
So that it wasn't so much an unfriendly sending back. It was like a missionary sending him back.
That's what I interpret Rashi to say.
Uh-huh. Well, I tend to be with you on that one, but Shlomo and I can argue that one out at another
I
time.
tend to be with him on that one too. I just wanted to raise the point about the verb shalach.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Okay. And Steve, you say wrestling with God. Could you explain that? We have.
Well, I was I was reacting to the comments of my fellow congregants here, and what is the purpose of all these different interpretations or fuzziness, so to speak, and it just sort of resonated with the word Israel, and that we're not only wrestling with God, but with the teachings, and in essence, being more into predicate theology than anything else. We're wrestling with what the pathway in life, and how we live our lives, and how to be as godly as possible in our practices, aligned with justice, etc. And so that's what this tension between, again, absolutism and relativism, to find that pathway.
I think we are wrestling with God, and that's what the whole point of the different choices, the different voices, all of it is. So I see our time is up, so thank you very much. And I look forward to next week where we're going to be discussing Mishpatim. And